Okay, looks like we have folks dialing in, so we'll get started in just a few seconds. Great, so it looks like we have most folks dialed in, so we'll go ahead and get started. So hello to everyone, and first of all, I hope that you're all staying very safe and healthy from wherever you're dialing in from. Thank you for joining us for the second in a two-part webinar series focused on exploring key considerations for measuring and managing impact. I'm Hannah Dittrich on the GIIN's research team. Before we get started on the next slide, just a couple housekeeping items. So you're all automatically on mute, but we really encourage you to actively participate and to submit questions at any time using the chat function. We'll have dedicated Q&A, so definitely do keep the questions coming. I also encourage you to get involved and to tweet about the webinar or any interesting IMM content at our Twitter handle at the GIIN. And then lastly, the webinar will be recorded and we'll circulate this along with the slides afterwards. So on the next slide, for our hour today, I'm excited to share some findings from the GIIN's latest research on impact measurement and management practice, or IMM. We'll ground this in three questions. Why might I measure and manage my impact? What do I measure? And how do I measure and manage my impact and kind of operationalize this effectively? And then I'm most excited to have two practitioners on the line as well, Aneesa Doherty from Tiedemann Advisors and Jimena Escobar de Nogales from Bamboo Capital, who will really kind of bring these findings to life by sharing their approaches to IMM. On the next slide, for those of you quickly not as familiar, the GIIN is a nonprofit dedicated to increasing the scale and effectiveness of impact investing. We do this in several ways, through our membership network of over 300 stakeholders, through our capital mobilization program, through our program on IRIS Plus and impact measurement and management, and lastly, by providing research on the impact investing industry. So before I get into that, I'll pass it over quickly to my colleague Leticia Eme on the GIIN's IRIS Plus and impact measurement and management team. So over to you, Leticia.
Thank you, Hannah. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to help open this session today, highlighting the importance of IMM practice, which, given the global health and economic crisis we're living, is quite urgent. As many of you know, the GIIN has a bold vision for a future where all investors integrate social and environmental factors into investment decisions as a normal way of doing business. And to achieve this vision, all impact investing stakeholders need to make decisions not just on financial data, but on impact data as well. Otherwise, how do we know if we're making a difference or how much of a difference we're making? We really can't live in a world where impact decisions are based on hunches or best guesses. When investors make decisions based on impact data, they're also able to allocate capital more effectively because they know what works and what doesn't. Data-driven decisions also mean better results. And with this, I not mean just financial results, but better results for those who are experiencing the effects, namely people and or the planet. And particularly these days, as investors around the world are allocating capital to get the global and regional economies back together. Now more than ever, we need to know which investments are making a difference and how much of a difference. For those of you who are familiar with the core characteristics of impact investing, which outline the four essential practices that define what are the baseline expectations of what is to be an impact investor, you will know that managing impact is one of them. So what this means is that IMM is at the core of impact investing. That said, at the GIIN, we know that some investors still struggle when it comes to implementing solid IMM practices. And this is why At the GIIN, we work in several ways to enable all impact investors to implement high-quality IMM practice as the norm. One of the ways in which we do that is through IRIS Plus, which is the area I work in. So happy to answer any questions later or provide my email if you have any questions. And IRIS Plus is a generally accepted system to measure, manage, and optimize impact. So basically, this system helps you understand what to measure and how to do it. Another way in which we help also make sure that all investors can implement high quality IMM practice as the norm, and the reason we're here today is our research work, which sheds light, for example, on the state of IMM practice around the world, areas of progress, areas that are still a challenge, and what we as an industry can and need to tackle. So this second edition of the State of IMM survey, which was published in January of 2020, does exactly this. And I'm really excited for the session today, where we'll be sharing takeaways from the survey, but also opening up to practitioners, as Hannah just mentioned, who will share their experience and their perspective on implementing high quality IMM practices. So with that, Hannah, I'll pass it back to you.
Great, thank you, Leticia. Wonderful. So to kick off our conversation, I'm most excited to share on the next slide some research findings on industry-wide IMM practice from the GIIN's latest report, The State of Impact Measurement and Management Practice. This research delves into one of the core aspects, as Leticia mentioned, of what it means to be an impact investor, which is measuring and managing your impact. The report provides a comprehensive overview of industry practice, drawing on responses from 278 impact investing organizations around the world. So first of all, a big thank you to those of you on the line who participated in this research. This is the second edition of this report. So this edition also includes trends analysis that shows how IMM practice is changing over time. And I definitely encourage you all to view the report on the GIIN's website. So one of the first questions on the next slide in an impact measurement and management, or IMM practice, is why measure and manage my impact? So we see on the next slide that impact investors have several motivations for doing IMM. These, of course, include impact-related reasons, but also financial or business reasons. On the impact side, investors seek to really understand what progress they're making towards their impact goals. And they also seek to report on this progress to their stakeholders. Another reason is to actually improve their impact performance. And this is maybe kind of especially important or relevant now in light of the current global pandemic and the role of impact investing, where we see it's especially critical to really use data to understand where the need is and to implement solutions that really work to address these needs. On the financial side, investors note that there's also strong business value derived from measuring and managing impact. They do IMM to capture the business value from impact data, to communicate their impact for fundraising or marketing purposes, and to address client demand for this information. The third motivation for doing IMM is for compliance reasons, or to adhere to government regulations. On the next slide. So as we know, the top motivation for doing IMM is to understand progress towards one's impact goals. And one aspect of this is the stakeholders that investors seek to impact. And respondents have a particular focus on benefiting financially vulnerable groups. Most commonly, these are individuals of a certain socioeconomic status. And almost 2/3 of respondents also target women and girls. And again, just kind of thinking about the current climate we find ourselves in, these types of stakeholders tend to be especially vulnerable or disproportionately affected to economic shocks and instability, including a health crisis like the one we find ourselves in today, signaling that it's important, especially now, to use impact data around stakeholders in situations like these. On the next slide, in addition to these stakeholder groups, nearly 2/3 of respondents target environmental impact as well. Within this group, 9 in 10 respondents target terrestrial regions. Over half focus on air or on freshwater regions as well. And then on the next slide, to reach these stakeholder groups and ecoregions, investors target a range of impact themes. Overall, they demonstrate a strong commitment to providing basic services, such as employment, financial services, health, education, energy, for example. So investors certainly have a range of motivations for doing IMM, but what we see across the board is that collectively, investors really do agree on the importance of measuring and managing impact. So on the next slide, we understand what some of the motivations are. The second question is, what do I measure? So to help answer this question of what do I measure on the next slide, investors look at various kind of aspects of impact, the most common being the outputs as well as the outcomes of their research, of their work. And I think our speakers will help add some good color on what this looks like for them later on. And then on the next slide, to make this a bit more concrete, we see that most investors set impact targets. This proportion has also increased from the first time we did this research 2 years ago, from just over 60% of respondents to almost 80% this year, reflecting, I think, in part a growing recognition of the importance of setting these impact targets. And there are different types of targets, both quantitative and qualitative. And most commonly, respondents set some of each type of quantitative and qualitative targets. And then on the next slide, targets can be set at many different levels as well. Most commonly, respondents set targets at the investment level. Over half set targets at the fund level as well. And again, it's common to kind of see targets set at multiple levels. And on the next slide, to set these, investors look at data and evidence and also use various stakeholders' input. So most commonly, investors kind of start with the big problems that they hope to address and then set targets to help measure progress against these challenges. Another approach is to develop targets in line with global development agendas, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, or the Paris Climate Accord, for example. And as I mentioned, many stakeholders also influence target setting. So almost half of respondents set targets in line with their investors' objectives or in line with their investees' objectives. And then lastly, we also see that some respondents work with third-party consultants to set their impact targets. So we definitely see the diversity of motivations for IMM, and also that there's kind of a collection of pathways to arrive at the targets that are appropriate for one's strategy. So lastly, on the next slide, we've gone over what to measure. The next question is, how do I measure and manage impact? So on the next slide, there are many tools and resources available for IMM. The most commonly used are the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which have gained significant traction across the global development community. Also common are the IRIS Catalog of Metrics and the IRIS Plus Core Metric Sets. I'll touch on that in just a moment. But what we see here is that investors often use more than one system or framework in their IMM practice, with the average being 3. And that kind of makes sense, since different tools and resources are designed to kind of address different needs in an IMM process. For example, defining a strategy, deciding which metrics to use, and so on. So on the next slide, to look a little closer at one of these common tools, IRIS Plus is a system for measuring, managing, and optimizing impact. The IRIS Plus system really kind of provides a common way to frame impact goals. It provides a strong evidence base of research and data to inform these goals, and a core set of impact metrics that are most relevant to a given strategy. It has lots of other great practical guidance and resources, and also aligns with over 50 other tools and frameworks like the SDGs, among others. So this is a free and public good available on the GIIN's website. So I definitely encourage you all to check it out and to utilize it. So on the next slide, we know about setting targets and about some of the tools available. The last consideration is around who does IMM. And we see that it's often most integrated into the responsibilities of the overall investment team. Although we also see that about half of respondents have staff dedicated to IMM. And IMM is also often a shared responsibility among senior leadership, which I think is a great signal of the internal buy-in for the importance of IMM. And then on the last slide, just as IMM responsibilities are often integrated, investors integrate impact data throughout the investment process as well. So impact data inform many parts, including broader investment strategy, such as overarching portfolio strategy, and are used in the early parts of the investment process, such as screening and due diligence, for example. But most investors then continue to use these impact data throughout the investment process, for example, in investment management. So we see that IMM is really not kind of one point in time, but rather a process that takes place at different times and in different ways. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there. Again, this is just a preview of the data available in the report, so definitely encourage everyone to check out the full report on our website. So I'm really excited to bring our speakers on the line to really kind of bring these concepts to light. So I'll hand it over to our first panelist, Aneesa Doherty of Tiedemann Advisors, to discuss how she approaches IMM. So over to you, Aneesa.
Thanks, Hannah, and hi, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. Like Hannah said, my name is Aneesa Doherty, and I work on the investments team at Tiedemann Advisors. And so, Sarah, if you want to go to the next slide. So just by way of context, Tiedemann is an employee-owned multifamily office founded in 1999 in New York City. But since then, we've grown to have more of a national footprint and are increasingly working with clients outside the U.S. So we have a global mandate, which has been interesting for our impact work. We have about $22 billion in assets under management, which we manage on behalf of foundations and families, both impact and non-impact. And one thing I should mention is we are an open architecture firm. So what that means is we don't run any investment strategies in-house. We are rarely the ones selecting an individual company to receive an equity investment or a loan. Instead, what we do is we work with external asset managers who deploy capital on our behalf, either within a particular asset class, like private equity, or theme, like education. And I mention this because it shapes the way we approach impact measurement and management, or IMM. As an asset allocator, we may own thousands of underlying companies at a given time across different asset classes, different themes, different geographies, and that is the view through which we look at IMM, which is hopefully a helpful context for this discussion. So could you skip to the next slide? So when I think about our IMM process, what stands out to me is how much it's evolved over the last 15 years. We made our first impact investment, I think in 2006. It was a one-off loan to a nonprofit in the Pacific Northwest. And early on, our impact work was custom, it was informal, it was entirely driven by clients who wanted to activate all of their capital to address social and environmental issues that they cared about. And that was reflected in our approach to IMM, which was equally informal. So impact was not consistently incorporated into investment diligence. It was seen more as a client communication tool, less as a decision-making tool. And that was evident in our reporting. I think our first impact report, this was 5-6 years ago, was basically a one-pager with a series of rankings from 1 to 10. So very, very simple. But as our impact practice has grown over the years, it's forced our IMM approach to change really across almost every dimension, from its purpose to the way it's staffed. I think the most important change is that IMM is now used as a decision-making tool. It's a formal part of our research and manager monitoring process. The entire team is involved, so it's not centralized within a single internal resource. And that's allowed us to improve our reporting. So we've moved away from rankings, which I think tend to sometimes obscure what a client owns, and now use a mix of quantitative data paired with case studies. And when possible, we try to align with industry frameworks like the UN SDGs. So hopefully that gives you a sense of how we've evolved. If you want to go to the next slide. I think the next obvious question is, what does that mean actually in practice? When I think of IMM, I think of it in terms of pre and post-investment IMM, with the bulk of the work occurring pre-investment. So pre-investment, before we commit capital to a given theme, we spend a lot of time trying to identify the type of interventions we'd like to support. If possible, we leverage publicly available research from think tanks, government bodies, but the reality is very little of that is geared towards investing. So what that means is we also do a lot of primary research. So for example, when we were building our education theme, I spent several months talking to educators, school administrators, education companies, policymakers, to understand the type of business models and the type of capital that was needed. And as allocators, again, we do not pick or choose individual investments. We are not able to be extremely targeted, but we can steer our capital in the general direction of where we'd like to go. And so that thematic research shapes how we search for and diligence individual asset managers. We tend to look for managers that are already focused on business models and beneficiaries that we've identified during our thematic research phase. We're also looking for managers who are already tracking impact metrics because it informs their understanding of how their companies are scaling, how effective their companies are. We want impact investments where the social and environmental benefit is tied to the financial outcome. We're trying to avoid trade-offs. And so normally the funds we work with are already leveraging the type of impact metrics and impact data to better understand how their businesses are scaling into the future. And then finally, we continue to monitor those metrics over time. So that's the kind of pre-investment portion of our IMM process. I would say it accounts for maybe 80% of the work that we do on IMM. If you want to go to the next slide. So post-investment IMM, this is more focused on client communication. This is more focused on aggregating data across all of our impact investments. Annually, we try to produce a relatively high-quality impact report for our clients using a mix of quantitative data alongside qualitative case studies. We try to give clients first a portfolio view of what they own, and then we provide manager by manager specific impact data and case studies. And where possible, we align with industry frameworks like the UN SDGs. But again, our overarching goal is to be simple and to be transparent. We want our clients to understand what they own, why they own it, and how it ties to their impact mandates. Probably, when I think about the post-investment IMM portion of our work, the most challenging part has been figuring out a way to scale our impact reporting across our entire client base. Gathering data from our managers has not been that difficult. What has been difficult is figuring out a way to scale and aggregate this information across client portfolios. We probably spent the last 2 or 3 years trying to figure out ways to leverage back-end systems to make this process easier. And we've had success in some places, but we've been challenged in others. One area that remains challenging is just getting systems to function in a way that allows us to aggregate information. So, for example, we would love to be able to answer, what's a client portfolio's water intensity or carbon intensity at a high level? What was the level of job creation that occurred in a given year in that portfolio? What proportion of the businesses that client owns have diverse management teams? We can do that on an individual manager basis, but we're still in the process of trying to figure out a way to aggregate that information at the portfolio level. If you want to go to the next slide. So hopefully that gives a general sense of our approach to IMM, which has definitely changed over the years, I think for the better. I think in general, our biggest lessons learned are, number one, incorporate IMM throughout the investment process. It yields much better results in the long term, not just for impact, but also for financial return. In my experience, the investments that have been subject to the greatest impact scrutiny have also performed the best. Number two, we try to be collaborative with our managers. We understand that collecting data can be extremely difficult and costly, especially in markets outside of the United States. We want to make sure that we're focusing on metrics that are useful to the decision-making process and help us understand the health of the business, how they're scaling, and how effective they are. And then third, when it comes to the post-investment portion of IMM, so reporting, we really try to focus on being simple and transparent. We found that clients tend to get confused by rankings even when they're explained. And for us, the real gap is not gathering impact data from our managers, which tend to be very forward-thinking on that matter, but rather getting systems to work in a way where we can scale up information at the portfolio level. So I will pause there. Hopefully that gives helpful context in terms of how we think about IMM.
Great, thank you so much, Aneesa. That was really insightful, especially to see how your approach has evolved over time, and also what IMM can look like when investing through fund managers. As a quick reminder, definitely send your questions in through the chat, and then we'll have time for them in just a few minutes. So first, I will hand it to Jimena Escobar de Nogales of Bamboo Capital, who will add, I think, a really complementary perspective from the perspective of a fund manager working directly with investees. So over to you, Jimena.
Thank you. Thank you, Hannah, Sarah, and the whole GIIN team for inviting us to share Bamboo's thoughts and experiences on impact management. And good afternoon or evening or morning to all of you partners in lockdown, I guess. I think it's been said before, but I think I want to reiterate that this pandemic has rendered impact management even more important than ever before. And the reason I see this is because I think it has made us see the extent of interconnectedness. And what I would argue is that impact management is nothing else than uncovering the effects of what our actions, decisions, and our use of resources and how they affect our ecosystem. So I think that in that sense, we're at a good time in the sense that there's probably a growing interest in understanding how one uncovers the intention and the actions that result as an intentional impact, as well as those that are more difficult to find and recognize, the unintended consequences of our investments. And if anything, it's become very clear with the pandemic that we're very often unaware of risks and ill-prepared, and we have a general incapacity to see these unexpected, I mean, apart from perhaps Bill Gates and a few others, where the next risks come from. And that's basically what I think our nascent discipline of impact management is about. So let me get started. Perhaps we move to the next slide. I'd like to briefly go through Bamboo and who we are. These slides will remain with the GIIN, so you can consult them there. And we are very reachable people, so you can reach out to us at any time if you want to learn more about any specific funds that I will mention. But perhaps suffice it to say now that Bamboo has been around since 2007. It's a spin-off child, if you wish, of Blue Orchard, same father, founding father Jean-Philippe Descrevel, a pioneer in the impact investing field. The company is headquartered in Europe, has roughly 30 staff members and 5 offices. And we started out pretty much as a private equity fund investing in financial inclusion. Have evolved from that, and you will see in the next slide, please, that, yeah, no, this one, yes, that these are the funds that we have. There are currently over, I believe, 5 funds that are active in different stages of some of them in divestment stage, others in fundraising stage. The first generation of funds, I would say, what is called the FIF1, Financial Inclusion Fund 1, Financial Inclusion Fund 2, Oasis. Well, Oasis not, but the two financial inclusions were focused obviously on financial inclusion, and that's where we were born out of our basis, and where much of our learning comes from, including in the impact management area. The second generation of funds have are more recent and are very interesting in the sense that they have a partnership behind them. OGF, for instance, is a fund to promote off-grid renewable energy in Haiti, together with the World Bank. ABC is an agribusiness, agri-smallholder farming fund done with IFAD. CARE is with the International Trade Center, and it's based more on gender equity and promotion of gender equality and woman-owned enterprise in Southeast Asia. I think we can move to the next slide, please. So basically, our main impact claim is the one you see here in the body of this smiling lady. It says we focus on companies addressing critical needs of low to middle income customers across emerging and frontier markets. And that's pretty much, we haven't deviated from that. We, as I mentioned earlier, we're initially more in financial inclusion. Now we've expanded to other sectors, renewable energy, healthcare, and technology-based investments that facilitate access to these basic services. The SDGs here too are that appear in this slide are basically to show that we too have been aligning our objectives, our goals, and with the framework which has imposed itself as pretty much the framework we're all using, and because of its clarity and also because of its objectives of measurement and the tools that it offers. Next slide, please. So I would say that the impact management is deployed at 3 different levels. I think from Aneesa's presentation and also from the research that GIIN presented, this is quite, it's the way to go, right? You have a set of tools at the level of the corporation, Bamboo Corporate. What we developed is basically a tool that's our go-to tool, which is an impact management system where we basically define the responsibilities of the staff, our guidelines, what we call it impact, how we're trying to measure it, what standards we consider are the most important reference for ourselves as we go about it. The initiatives, industry initiatives we are part of and we support and we learn from and hopefully contribute to, etc. Then at the second level, I would say Bamboo's funds level. And of course, as you saw earlier, some of these these funds are quite specific. The CARE, She Trade fund, for instance, with CARE, clearly has a gender focus. So this means that every fund has a specific theory of change in it, and which has been developed with our partners and which are quite detailed and elaborate and going through the logical framework of a theory of change, right? And identifying what you want to do, what your inputs are, what the outputs are, what the expected outcomes are, etc. At the level of the investees, well, we, as Aneesa also shared, we have a life cycle process, which basically goes from the very first element of pre-due diligence, understanding if that investment you're looking at, for instance, I don't know, it might be a company in Indonesia in fair trade or what have you, whichever it is, whether it meets that impact claim of ours. We conducted desk due diligence initially to see this. Once we gain some comfort, we go on site and conduct the due diligence, which is normally a 4I principle, and in which we conduct interviews with all the major stakeholders. And this is, of course, the board of the company, the management, staff, customers. I also think that it's important to listen to former customers. You get quite a lot of information from them. competitors, regulators, non-customers. So we really try to go wide and understand what is this company, what is its value, how is it perceived, what are the risks. Did I mention regulators? Yeah, I think so. So now, once we decide to invest, and an investment memo is, of course, presented to the investment committee. Let's say that then happens. Then the structuring of the investment is, of course, very important. And I think that, given that we're mostly a private equity company, and I'd like to compare it, I don't know if I should, but it's almost like private equity is more like a marriage relationship. So instead of dating, which one could say is more the loan, the fixed capital relationship. But in this more long-term relationship, I do think that for us it's critical to see our partners as partners. So I do think that in the impact management process, it's critical that they have the leading role, in the sense that they own the process. It's not us dictating what indicators are going to have to be submitting to us on a quarterly basis, but rather the process should be, they have an impact claim. What is it that we jointly, and we do go to IRIS as the main reference, what indicators there are likely to show in the best way whether they're advancing towards that objective or not. During the investment holding period, to come back to the life cycle, we're basically looking at these data that we're receiving and analyzing together with the company the extent to which they are advancing or not. Now, we've regularly conducted GIIN assessments, which have been very useful, and a learning process also for the companies and for ourselves in understanding all these dimensions of impact. And at times we've selected whatever comes from that GIIN assessment, whether we see a gap in between the principles and the practices that in one specific area. It could be, I don't know, the development of a staff manual, the development of an ethical code, or obtaining a certificate, a smart certification, for instance, for an MFI, whatever it is that institution thinks is a progress towards better social performance and impact. We might then work together with them. I wouldn't say we would do this across the whole portfolio. It would be too much investment, but we do selectively try to add value at that level. Let's go to slide 6, please. So what I would want to argue here is that, sorry, I'm going to get a drink of water. That I would say that the main ingredients of impact management are empathy, data, and logic. And I know it's rare to quote things that come from the realm of emotions and not science here, but I do think that empathy is super important. And it's interesting enough, somebody once asked me, what do you think that an impact manager needs to have? And my response was that empathy. And of course you want logic, you want all kinds of all these other things, but I do think that empathy is our capacity to really imagine ourselves in the position of that person we're trying to serve. Imagine that person, and then I don't know if I have the time, but I'll give you an example that comes to my mind. I remember visiting in Mumbai with a loan officer from a microfinance institution we were invested in. We've since divested from this company, but we were visiting a slum. We went on a motorcycle. We went through the streets of this and went into the house of this woman, a client of this institution that lent only to women. And then later that night at the hotel, I was thinking, what would I feel if tomorrow my bank manager knocks on the door of my house and walks in, basically, or expects to be let in, and on the argument that he might, I don't know, maybe perhaps I have a mortgage with that bank. But it is, I mean, we would be very surprised, right? We would be very scandalized of such an approach. So I think that when I speak of empathy, that's pretty much what I'm trying to signal, that it's the capacity to put yourself in that situation and think, with what right am I asking this question? Is this just because I'm a curious person by nature, or is the information I'm obtaining really useful to serve that client better, to understand better the use that client is doing of whatever product or service? And we should always have that in mind. Now the data, of course, from this connection to the customers and understanding the customers, we will extract data. There's some big data is around, it's cheaper to collect. We should be constantly obtaining data, which is of course relevant, solid, standardized, reliable. And then of course the logic, which is always the most, the critical perhaps. And let's move to slide 7, please. And here I'd like to give you 15 seconds to react, or 30, let's say. I'd like to see, and perhaps we can use that chat, if anybody wants to comment on what it is you're seeing in this photo. Can I see the chat, Hannah or Sarah?
I don't think you can see the chat, but I can see it.
Okay, so how about you tell us if anybody's writing anything about what this photo provokes on them, or what they see here, what's... No reactions?
I see someone saying women fishing.
Mm-hmm. Any other guesses? Any other observations about this photo?
Another person says trying to catch fish. I see a baby on the back. I see the use of plastic and maybe environmental implications there.
Right.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Thanks. Okay. Now, what if I tell you that this photo is the illustration of a broken theory of change? What we're seeing here is the image indeed of women fishing, probably the Great Lakes region, which is an endemic area for malaria. And the net that they are using is an insecticide-treated bed net, which becomes useless for that purpose of malaria prevention once you use it for fishing. Let's move to the next slide and we'll perhaps illustrate this. So what happens if let's try for a second to imagine that we are an NGO that has the objective of combating, reducing the endemic malaria in a certain region. So that's the problem we're trying to solve. The goals is malaria elimination, inputs and activities. We have staff, resources. We find out what the best insecticide-treated nets are. We get the logistics right. We find the distribution, the price, adequate price. We send them out. We have the communication. Outputs, 582 million insecticide-treated mosquito nets delivered globally between 2014 and 2016 in Sub-Saharan Africa. So this is where it breaks. If we are that NGO and that was what we were trying to do, you see the outputs, we can check the box, tick the box that we delivered the insecticide-treated bed nets. And that makes me think of the number that you were mentioning on as a result of your findings on the report, that you said 91% of the surveyed are the reporting outputs, and so are we, because reporting outcomes is basically finding out the question of the so what question, as I like to call it. So what? You distributed the insecticide-treated net. Did it help reduce malaria? That's the question, right? You gave the loan. Did it help reduce poverty? You gave the treatment. Did it contribute? See? So the outcome question is really the most interesting part, but it's something we often fail to be able to solve. And so let alone the impact, which is more, I mean, here outcomes we could think of before I go to impact would be less absenteeism at work or at school due to disease, less of loss of revenue, less expenses in healthcare, greater productivity, for instance. So this never occurred, right? In that simple, okay, I'm simplifying everything, I agree. But in that simple example, right, the causality broke at one point. And I think that's a question that brings us back to the listening, to the actively listening to the clients. Had we observed and listened more carefully, perhaps we would have realized this alternative use of the insecticide-treated bed nets. Let's move to the next slide, please. So again, this
Jimena,
is sorry.
Oh, just a quick reminder let's try and wrap up maybe in 2 or 3 minutes. Just so.
Sorry.
I don't want to interrupt you.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Super
You're right.
insightful.
So quickly, well, I mean, this one basically illustrates the adequate outcome resulting from the adequate use. Let's move to the next one. Basically, I wanted to share with you that what we have done at Bamboo is developed a number of outcome surveys to try to find that holy grail of the outcome question. And our recommendation and we can move to the last slide from Bamboo is basically that it's worth the money. We have done this in 3 locations: Brazil, Kyrgyzstan, and Zambia. We've investing less than around $5,000 each time. They've been punctual exercises to understand the use of the product or the service, and they've been able to offer critical information that has been able to be put back into the way the company designs or distributes or after sales services the product. Thank you, and sorry for going over the time.
Oh no, that's absolutely fine. Thank you so much, Jimena. This was just really captured my attention. It was lovely listening to you. Wonderful. So I want to make sure we open it up to questions from the audience, and I see some coming in. So let's see, maybe a question first to go to you, Jimena. Really insightful, talking about kind of the importance of looking at outcomes and not just outputs. So this question is about what is the appetite in the impact investing community from your perspective to really be able to measure outcomes, and what kind of percentage or how many, how common do you see it as, that investors are willing to kind of give up measuring outputs to really look at outcomes, or to kind of focus more on outcomes?
Shall I speak now? Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I would say we definitely need to continue measuring outputs, right? Because it is one step in this logical framework. But what I also think is that we sometimes miss to use information that is already out there. I mean, just the amount, for instance, of complaint books in microfinance institutions, all that is a wealth of information. I also think that we need to work better with data collection options, electronic ones that are available. I think we need to be more clever in the way that we search for the voice of the customer. And I think we also need to do this together with the companies we're invested in. I don't see it as an exercise of us going to find out on our own from a fund manager sitting in Geneva or wherever, whether that investee of ours is doing the proper job. It's rather sitting down with the COO, for instance, in the case of Zambia, that was the COO, to find out what is it that we want to understand about the use of savings in this clientele, and what do we want it for. And at times there's some resistance to doing these exercises, but if they understand, the company understand that this not only is a marketing exercise, but it will help them serve their customers better, it's in the benefit of all. I also think, responding to your question more perhaps directly, is that we need to share more information among fund managers and be willing to compare notes and to be more humble and to acknowledge when things don't work according to what we have planned, and to sit down and share information. I don't think that fund managers have the role to do RCTs and that type of things, of exercises, which are extremely expensive. But I do think we should be better users of information, including academic information from JPAL and Innovations Poverty Lab, for instance. I'll stop here.
Perfect. Thank you. I have another question for Aneesa. You spoke about obviously working with different fund managers. What has been your experience kind of getting fund managers to better standardize impact data and metrics that they're reporting on? And how have they kind of shown willingness to collaborate with each other in this process of standardization?
Yeah, it's a good question, and our approach depends on the sector or the theme that we're working within. There are certain themes where standardization is fairly easy to achieve. For example, when I think about our renewable energy investments, the metrics are, fairly straightforward. Megawatt hours of renewable energy produced, CO2 equivalent, tons of CO2 equivalent eliminated. So relatively straightforward. And I think there has been a good amount of collaboration between managers working in those spaces. Where it becomes a lot more challenging is when we work with managers who have a more generalist approach or are working with companies that have very, very different business models. So for example, when I talked about education, we work with an education private equity manager that invests in a range of education companies, all targeted on improving access to quality education, improving educational outcomes. But the way we get at output data and outcomes are very, very different depending on the type of company that they're working with. So for example, some companies, you need randomized control trials to understand efficacy and improvements in learning long term across different types of populations. For other types of companies, you need to tease out efficacy through survey data, and there it's really driven by what are the metrics that are most appropriate for the company, and standardization is a little bit harder to achieve. So I would say there's some sectors, for example, the environmental sector, where we are already seeing quite a lot of standardization, and there are other sectors like education where we see a little bit less standardization. So that's something that we work with our managers on. So hopefully that answers the question.
Absolutely, that's really helpful. I'm going to take one more question that I think would be interesting to hear from both of you on. One kind of important point, I think, is how IMM and impact data kind of impacts or hopefully benefits investees or fund managers that you're working with as well. So I'm wondering if you can both give an example, perhaps, where IMM has resulted in better either company or fund manager results or some kind of pivot. So maybe, Jimena, we can start with you if you have some insight there.
Indeed, in the case of the microfinance institution in Zambia, one of the things we wanted to understand is why the savings product was not picking up in the way that we wanted, and at the time we were also in contact with the Duflo sisters, and if I may call them that way, and because one is an MIT, the other one is with lab in Poverty Lab, right, in New York. And they had recently done a research on the use of savings in microfinance. And one of the things they had found out, which was very interesting to us, was that, I think it was from a research in Ghana, was that if you name the product of the saving product with the name of the purpose that you have, let's imagine you have a daughter whose name is Marie, and you want to pay her education, you call that product Marie's Education. That is a better incentive to savings than even increasing the interest rate. So that's something that we looked at, for instance, in the context of that microfinance institution. But back to our survey, we found out, for instance, a number of things about the training of the sales force and the fact that they were not adequately explaining that you could withdraw savings from a savings account, that there was an interest rate, all these elements that were found during the survey that were plugged back into the way that the company was in the future selling that product. Thank you.
Yeah. So
yeah, go ahead.
sorry to interrupt. It's interesting. We haven't worked with. We tend to work with impact asset managers that are specialists within a particular theme or area, and the companies that they work with tend not to pivot. They're not drastically changing their approach. What they will do is use impact data and impact outcomes to refine their approach, to better understand what's working, what's not working. You know, I mentioned education earlier. A good example is an education STEM company that we had exposure to through the education manager that I was mentioning earlier. We worked with that manager in part because of their large focus on impact measurement. They work with a lot of foundations to raise grant capital to prove out efficacy for their companies. And in this case, this company ran an efficacy test. So they were doing a randomized control trial to understand how their products improved math outcomes for kids ages grades 4 through 6, and they were able to see an increase in math scores over time, not only across the student base in general, but across high-risk students. For example, they focused on students that were from transient households. Many of them were homeless, so helping them improve their test scores over time. And so as a result, this company was able to better understand the impact that they were having, not only across students in general, but across high-risk students, and use that to enhance their work with schools. So we primarily focus on working with managers that are able to connect their companies to resources that help them better assess and understand the type of impact that they're having.
Thank you, Aneesa. That was super interesting. We are almost at the top of the hour. It's really flown by. So there have been lots more questions that came in, and we'll hope to see if we can follow up on these in some way. First, I'll pass it back to Leticia to say just a couple of kind of closing words.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you both, Jimena and Aneesa. I think you made it so practical and so easy to follow. And so thank you for sharing both your approaches, but also for making it so practical for all of us to follow. I love what you said, Jimena, specifically about the empathy. I think that's something that many times is not, front and center, and that's something that we should never forget. So thank you for bringing that up. As we discussed today, it's clear that IMM is not a nice to have, but it's really a must have for all impact investors. And so what we wanted to point to you just before we close is, what are some resources that we have at the GIIN that you might find helpful in your IMM journey? So on the research front, as you know, we have the annual Impact Investor Survey. We also have the State of the IMM, State of Impact Investment Management survey that we just launched the second edition of, and this is what we reviewed today. And also, for those of you who are not familiar, we started doing last year the impact performance studies that help aggregate data and understand impact performance at a sector level. The first two editions, or the first two publications, looked at affordable housing and clean energy access, and we're currently working on financial inclusion and agriculture. So if you're interested in taking part of any of these studies, both financial inclusion or agriculture, please reach out to us we can get you in touch with the research team. Second, I'll point to IRIS Plus. I mentioned, and Hannah mentioned a little bit about it too, but in terms of next steps, IRIS Plus is an ongoing development, both in terms of thematic coverage, as well as in terms of developing practical guidance that can help you with your IMM practice. On thematic coverage, we're now working on quality jobs in partnership with the ILO, and we're about to launch climate change mitigation. So if you're interested in getting involved in any of these, please let us know. And then also we'll be working on bringing to you guidance on specific topics that we hear are of high demand and that can help you on your practice. And then the other final thing I'd like to mention is to please share with us your practice, any examples of your practice, challenges you faced, or progresses that you've achieved, or other things that you think as an industry we need to pay attention to. As Jimena was saying before, we need to share more and really, leverage this community of practice to make sure we keep advancing the practice and the industry. So thank you very much, and Hannah, back to you.
Great. So that really concludes the webinar. I want to say that we're exploring additional topics for future webinars and just to keep the conversation going. So please send us those, send those our way if you have any. There will be a quick post-webinar survey that will pop up on your screen automatically. So we'd love to gather your reactions and feedback. So please do let us know your thoughts when that pops up. So thanks again to everyone so much for dialing in, and reach out if there's any other questions or comments, and please stay safe and healthy and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.